Good morning. What a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to speak this morning about the topic of breaches to bridges in the space of faith at work. To set the stage for that, I want to share just a little bit more about my background in the space of faith at work, my faith testimony of coming to Christ at work, because it kind of leads into everything I want to cover today. I grew up in a happy but not holy household in Boulder, Colorado. My parents had walked away from the church for different reasons, so I knew that there was religion, and I knew some people believed in a God, but I really didn't have any frame of reference for that. And then years later, as a student at Harvard University, I encountered people from all over the world who represented all of the major faith traditions of the world, and they'd all found God's truth. Their truths were contradictory. Truth doesn't contradict itself, and I was fascinated by that. But that was on the back burner, because what was on the front burner was my emerging career. So I graduate from Harvard with a degree in organizational development, and I land a job in Cincinnati, Ohio, working for Procter & Gamble, a multinational consumer products company. I end up being assigned to a brand called White Cloud toilet paper. This, at the time, was a struggling brand that was doing only $59 million of sales per year, and it wasn't meeting the profit targets for P&G. So in my fledgling career, my job in my first 6 months was to figure out how to make White Cloud more profitable. So I traveled all over the country to do focus groups. I was interviewing our target market, female heads of household aged 25 to 54. To find out why they buy toilet paper and would they buy White Cloud. And the answer that we got back was, most of them said White Cloud is softer and thicker than we want to pay for to flush down the toilet. And as a result, the only way we were going to make the product more profitable was to take what's called an indirect price increase. So, in my 7th month at P&G, I started working with manufacturing plants across the country. We took 30 sheets off of each roll, and then we wound the roll more loosely, so the diameter was the same as before the sheet count reduction. We took a tiny increase in the thickness of the paper, and my job was to market it as new and improved. New because it had 30 fewer sheets, and improved because it was thicker than ever. Needless to say, I was less than inspired. And I should add here, by the way, there's nothing illegal about doing this. Like when you buy potato chips, and it looks so full, and you open it up and it's 2/3 air and the 1/3 at the bottom is the chips. That's what this was. But I remember walking home from work and thinking to myself, I'm going to get promoted for short sheeting the consumer. I was depressed. Many of us have a midlife crisis. I had a quarter-life crisis. And my frustration with work, my sense of disorientation and disillusionment, my lack of purpose for work triggered a spiritual search that after 10 years of studying comparative world religion and philosophy led me to Christ at age 31. So my frustration with work leads me to faith, and then over time, God began to call me to bring faith into work. And in the most unusual way, Procter & Gamble and toilet paper were catalytic for my faith journey. Something else was also catalytic in my spiritual walk as time passed during my tenure at P&G. So I was assigned to what was then called the Walmart team. Now, a little background here. In P&G speak, consumers are the female heads of household aged 25 to 54 who buy product at Kroger or wherever. And Kroger and other supermarkets and places where you buy P&G products, those are called the customers. So Walmart was an emerging new customer, and I was assigned to a customer service team. Now I got to tell you something. P&G had never had customer service teams historically. Why all of a sudden were we starting to have one? Because Walmart was a high maintenance customer. P&G was accustomed to always getting things their way. They had built dominant market share presence in brand after brand. So you'd walk into a store, P&G products would have the most significant shelf space, not just the amount of space, but the positioning on the shelf. And P&G had innovated in marketing over the years to keep building up their presence. So for example, they invented the soap opera. The name for that comes from TV programs that were funded and produced by Procter & Gamble so that female heads of household aged 25 to 54 would watch those shows during daytime TV, and they were really just a vehicle for ads. So if you can imagine, in 1956, P&G launches As the World Turns. Mamie Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's wife, is glued to the TV set in the White House. And P&G's market share across all these brands continues to grow. And then all of a sudden, in the late 1980s, other customers like Walmart are starting to say to P&G, if you don't adhere to all of these special requirements, we won't carry your product. Your pallets have to be a certain size. You have to ship by a certain date. Your price point can't exceed this number. P&G was completely unaccustomed to being told what the terms of trade were. So I find myself on this team, and we walk into something called supply chain. I would wager during COVID, all of us here became very familiar with the supply chain and toilet paper shortages, right? Remember that? Because you start with raw materials and they work their way through till finally you have a finished product that's been consumed. And there's all of the manufacturing and distribution that takes place in between. So I became intimately familiar with supply chain issues while I worked at P&G. Here's what's fascinating. If you step back and think about supply chain logistics from a spiritual point of view, I would suggest to you that the church has a very broken supply chain. It is filled with broken links in the chain, with breaches that we need to bridge. Today I want to walk you through what some of those are. And they aren't just contemporary supply chain issues in the church, they're also historical. There are three distinctive forks in the road in church history that had a huge effect on how the church works. And the first one happened in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. So here's the scene. For hundreds of years, the early church has been going viral. Despite Roman occupation and persecution, the early church thrives under all of that pressure. And within 250 years, the number of Christians that were Roman citizens went from nothing to half the adult population of the Roman Empire. So Rome is suddenly compelled to adopt Christianity as the religion of the state. And that happens in 325 AD. But the Roman Emperor Constantine also issues an edict at that council that there will be an official distinction between what he called the clergy and the laity. The clergy were to be the spiritual people who were set aside to study the things of the faith. And the laity were all of us, the everyday people who were responsible for going to work, getting things done, and setting aside some of our money to fund the clergy to do their spiritual work. Essentially, what was happening here was a dichotomy between spiritual people and everybody else. And this distinction was completely foreign to the early church. They didn't think that way. The way they thought was, in our lives, whatever we think and whatever we do is either moving in the direction of God's will, which is good, or away from it, which is evil. And it doesn't matter if we're at work, at home, at large. We are to be faithful everywhere, all the time in our lives. But Constantine introduced a different understanding here. And this doesn't trace to theology, my friends. This is actually philosophy. This was Plato's dualism, to separate the sacred from the secular. And this philosophy, at at the Council of Nicaea permeates our religious thinking, and it begins to corrupt the working of the church. This was a major milestone in church history. But there was another one, the Protestant Reformation in 1517. So Martin Luther has a series of frustrations with the Catholic Church. There's a bunch of discussion and debate that goes back and forth, and he eventually breaks from the Catholic Church and forms what today we call Protestantism. Catholics, Protestants. As the centuries have passed, the number of denominations have grown. Today, there are over 45,000 Christian denominations in the world. The Apostle Paul says that we're one body, that the church is supposed to be one body. But I would suggest to you that as a supply chain, we are incredibly splintered. We are dismembered. But it gets worse, because in 1611, King James, when he was creating the King James version of the Bible, issued an edict to the scribes that everywhere in Scripture they found the word ecclesia, they were to replace it with the word church. Now, why was that a big deal? Now, the reason is that if we go to Matthew 16:18, Jesus is typically quoted to say, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." What most of us don't realize is that the word church there was originally and was actually ecclesia. What Jesus literally said to the people of that day was, "I will build my ecclesia, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." What's the difference? It turns out that ecclesia had a very specific meaning that we have lost in centuries of Christian history. It was created originally in Greece as a governing assembly, but it was perfected by the Roman Empire. When Rome would conquer a territory, they would win the peace by sending in what Rome called an ecclesia, a small number of upstanding Roman citizens who would move into the conquered territory. They would acculturate the locals in the language and the lifestyle of Rome until everyone around them walked and talked like a Roman. So at the time that Jesus is speaking to people, to Jewish people and others, about building his ecclesia, people understood the context because they were living under a Roman ecclesia that was trying to acculturate the Jewish people into Roman society. And Rome was frustrated because Jewish culture was strong and cohesive, and Rome was struggling, their ecclesia was struggling to assimilate the Jews into Roman culture. So when Jesus says to the people of that day, "I will build my ecclesia," he was saying, "I will raise up a small number of fully devoted followers who will infiltrate the culture for Christ, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against that." In this scripture, Jesus did not say, "I will build my synagogue," or "I will build my temple," although he loved them both very much. He said, "I will build my ecclesia." But by the time that King James is creating the King James Bible, church has come to mean more than just ecclesia. It's also a building, because there were lots of churches by then, and it was also considered a time of the week, because you would go to church. And King James was aggravated that the church was interfering with his governance. So what he wanted to do was to create a new mindset for Christians, to house the worship in the houses of worship. So if the scripture said, "I will build my church," what people would hear is, "I will build local churches." Now, I'm an elder in a local church, and I love the local church. So please don't hear me to say that I'm throwing the local church under the bus. All I'm saying is that Jesus' original strategy was not to build local churches. It was to build an ecclesia, all of you, who would go out into the world and bring a Christian worldview into the way the world works. So in Christian history, these three historical milestones corrupted our supply chain, our capacity for spiritual influence in the world. But it gets worse. Because in our contemporary society, if we look at the Big C church, we see that our supply chain continues to have lots of breaks. So for example, our seminaries, the academy, an educational institution that's established to raise up people of the faith, right? Pastors who will preach and teach, equip the saints for the work of the ministry. The hard truth is that the vast majority of seminaries are not equipping future pastors to understand the workplace where most of their congregants spend most of their waking hours. And so they're not in position to understand how to be helpful, and in many cases, they don't even realize the spiritual significance that comes from the workplace. Our ability to change the conditions of the world by being the church at work in places like business and education and government. This is lost in most seminaries. So the seminaries raise up future local church pastors who go into local church congregations, and the workplace is typically not a topic of conversation. Now, when I talk to local church pastors, they'll tell me, hey, the stuff that we preach from the pulpit on Sundays, it's always applicable to work. You know, like how to have better relationships and stuff like that. But then when I talk to the congregants who are in their congregations, they say, we never have any conversation about faith at work at our church. Why the disconnect? Because pastors are talking up here at 100,000 feet about major themes like communication and conflict resolution. But what do you do when you're at work and your employer is basically saying that it's okay for you to pad an expense report because of XYZ and then submit the expenses to a contractor or a supplier, and you know in your heart that ethically that isn't right? How do you communicate about that? How do you resolve that conflict? That's hard. And that's typically not something that we're covering in conversation through the local church. Then we have workplace ministries, of which there are thousands and thousands all over the country and internationally. There's a smattering of them here today, and many of you are affected by, hopefully blessed by, workplace ministries. So these are often called parachurches or nonprofits that are faith-based, and they are created and they are designed to equip and engage us to be faith active in our work. What's fascinating is that the majority of these workplace ministries bypass the local church. Why? Because they find the local church to be so slow and unadaptive and unaware that they would rather be more effective and efficient by working around the local church than working with the local church. So we have lots of workplace ministries, but they're disconnected from the churches. Then we have working Christians who, by and large, that's us, by and large, we avoid the cultural tension that comes with spiritual engagement at work. In 2018, the Barna organization did a research study on working Christians, and they found that only 28%, about 1 out of every 4 working Christians, even aspires to a faith life at work. Now, what does that mean, aspirational data? It means that if conditions were perfect, where your employer wouldn't push back, you wouldn't have any problems, if it was easy to bring your faith to work, would you do so? And even in those perfect conditions, only 1 out of every 4 of us would even think about our faith at work. Why? Because our mindsets tell us that work is secular and off limits to faith. And the hard truth is, secular is not a biblical concept. As Christians, we see a world where things are either sinful or sacred. There is no secular. I've also found, and you heard it in the introduction, that only 1 out of every 20 working Christians, 5%, consistently bring a Sunday faith to a Monday work. If we were a military operation, we would be AWOL, absent without leave, spiritually at work. It's that bad. And then we have what are called transformation movements. Sometimes these are also called city gospel movements or community flourishing movements. The idea here is, how do we as the Big C Church raise up quality of life in the communities where we work and where we live? And typically what we see is that these efforts, like if you had one of these here in Louisville, you would see local churches and to a lesser degree faith-based nonprofits that would come together and pray for the city and then figure out if there were some things that they could do collaboratively to address issues in the city, maybe childhood literacy or affordable housing, stuff like that. Hard truth, the vast majority of these transformation movements are not only formed by local churches and parachurches, but they are pretty much run by them. And the rest of us are pretty much on the sidelines until they need money. And then they'll approach us for some funding. But here's what the statistics tell us. Across the world, only 1% of working Christians are employed in local churches and faith-based nonprofits. 99% of us are employed everywhere else in the private, public, social sectors. So God hasn't just employed us as Christians in the workplace. I would suggest to you, He has deployed us to be the church where we work, in organizations, in industries, in communities. And the hard truth is, we typically don't connect those dots. And even in our collective efforts, we don't engage some of the most strategically positioned people who could make a difference. So our supply chain is really broken. And as I was Googling to look for a visual image of a bridge, like how do we bridge this gap? How do we fix this supply chain? This is a photo I discovered from a bridge in Vietnam. I thought it was absolutely so cool, the way that it's shaped. And it's aspirational. It's not just a functional bridge. There's a lot of aesthetics to this design. It's almost like the hands of Jesus holding up this bridge. Imagine that for a moment. And holding it in place for us together to walk across. And the question is, how are we going to go from the breaches, the breaks in the supply chain right now to a bridge? And I wish I could stand up here and tell you today, hey, there's just an easy fix and all we have to do is flip a switch and it's all better. And that's not the case. This is a very complicated, long-standing, and culturally ingrained problem. However, I have found something that's been helpful to me leading a workplace ministry in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I wanted to share it with you as a point of inception to start changing this, because it's my belief that the only way this is really going to change is when all of us as working Christians change our stinking thinking and start thinking and acting differently. It's my prediction that the institutions and organizations will be slower to change. But if we can start to change, especially as we raise up younger generations, where they think from the beginning about what it looks like for us to share the common cause of Christ at work, and to work collectively for the Big C Church through the workplace, instead of everybody's in their own silo, and we operate parallel but independently from each other. So, what did I find that helped? Surprisingly enough, it was a book written years ago by a guy named Ed Silvoso called Prayer Evangelism. This is a guy who over the decades has done a great deal of work building out faith communities in and through the workplace and focusing on transformational change in communities and cities and nations. But as a person, he's shy. And yet he felt called by God to be a real evangelist, originally in the city of Resistencia, Argentina, which is where he was living. And he developed a concept called prayer evangelism that came out of Luke chapter 10. So Luke 10 is where Jesus is sending out the 70 or 72 disciples, depending on the translation you read, to go out to surrounding towns and villages and share the good news of Christ. And he sends them out in teams of 2, and he basically says, this is the New International Chuck version. He basically says, everywhere you show up, be friendly, give a warm greeting. If they blow you off, dust off your sandals and move on. But if they're nice to you, hang out with them, build a relationship with them, and as you get to know them better, find out what their felt needs are. Find out what it looks like to be helpful for them. And then as you serve them and they come not just to know you, but to appreciate you, the day will come when they ask you, why did you care so much to go the extra mile for me? And you'll be able to explain that Jesus was your motivation. So we find in Luke chapter 10 that Jesus is laying out a 4-step prescriptive process to engage what was then a pre-Christian society, to bless people as we encounter them, to fellowship with them to build relationships, to minister to their felt needs, and then to proclaim Christ as the reason for our motivation. Now, what's amazing and what I'm about to tell you is that's a process that Jesus laid out to share the good news of Christ. I have found that I have needed to adapt that process to share the good news of unity with believers. So I go out in Cincinnati and other places to other Christians, and I bless them, and I fellowship with them, and I minister to their felt needs until they learn to know that I'm genuinely concerned about their welfare and genuinely want them to succeed. And then when they finally feel safe enough and trust me enough to say, you've really gone the extra mile for us, like tell me more about why you did that, then I can proclaim unity as my motivation. That we're supposed to be one body. And Jesus in John 17 speaks passionately about this. That as the church, we are to be one, as Jesus and the Father are one, and that the world will know that Jesus was sent to us by the unity that we show together in the world, including the work world. So, in the most ironic way, I have discovered that I need to be an evangelist for unity in the church. And it starts with me, and it starts with you. And that's, I believe, the point of inception to start fixing these breaches and to start building these bridges. One trusted relationship at a time. What I'd like to do now, in the time that I have left, and by the way, Ryan, how much time do I have left? 10 minutes. Okay. Rather than just I'm standing up here and it's a monologue, I would like to create a dialogue. So we've got one mic, and I'm going to come down off the stage here. I would love to have a conversation with all of you. From the things that I shared, I'm hopeful that there are some thoughts, questions, comments that some of you may have so that we can have some conversation back and forth about what I just shared. So is there someone here who has a first one? All right, here we go. All right, I'm going to give you an answer. And before I do, so you've lost 4 people over the years who were clients because of the atmosphere that you've created at the gym.
Yeah.
But how many clients do you have?
Well, we have around like 50.
You have about 50 clients?
Yeah.
Okay. And how many years have you been running?
9 years.
For 9 years. So it sounds like you have a sustainable practice. Okay.
Yes.
Here's why I wanted to ask those questions. Because the hard truth is that while he lost 4, he's gained a lot of others, and you're planting seeds every day with the people that are still coming to that gym. So my encouragement to you is to keep the atmosphere that you've established. And when people ask, explain, this is a gym that I run. These are my personal faith convictions. I want to create a welcoming atmosphere here that's consistent with my faith. So notice my language here. You're saying, this is something that's personal to me, but everyone is welcomed here, which you told me that you already tell them. And then to simply give them the opportunity to opt out, which you have if they choose to. But what I'm celebrating is the fact that the vast majority of the people that are coming to you have not opted out.
Yeah.
And let me ask as a question. I don't want to assume. I'm assuming that some of the people that have stayed with you are not Christians.
Some of them, yes. Some of them are not.
Yes. So he has a mix of Christians and non-Christians, and those non-Christians have chosen to stay. So I am actually here today to affirm and celebrate you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I remember a few years back, again, I grew up in Colorado, and some of you may have followed the very sad story of a cake baker in Colorado who made a decision based on faith beliefs not to bake a cake for a couple that was homosexual and getting married. And because the baker didn't bake the cake, ended up getting hauled ultimately in front of the Supreme Court in order to defend religious freedom. I think this is a major issue in our country, and I'm not going to stand here today and tell you that if you express faith at work that you're not going to encounter resistance and sometimes persecution. In fact, I may tell you just the opposite. But I also know that Scripture says to count it all joy. Amen. I know that God works through Romans 8:28. God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. It's my belief that even when the outcome may not be what we want, so somebody who leaves a gym and you wish they would have stayed, but ultimately, a sovereign God already knows what the outcomes are, and He's simply asking us to be faithful with the process. I also think, to go beyond your question, I believe that there is I'll call it a continuum between stained glass and plain glass. What I mean by that is, stained glass is all the language that we use as Christians with each other. It's the kind of wording that we would all understand what it is, but a lot of people would say, what are you talking about? Like a word like ecclesia or sanctuary or something like that. There are so many Christian terms that are completely unfamiliar and disorienting to people who aren't, right? So that's the plain glass side of things. And it's been my observation over the years that God designs each of us or positions each of us at work to be able to use different strategies for faith expression. And they cut across that continuum from very explicitly faith-based all the way to what I might almost call covert Christianity, the underground church. Let me give you an example of that. So my day job, besides running a workplace ministry, is a consulting firm. And I have a business partner who lives in California. And together with our company, we secured an account. This is a university that asks us to coach their top 40 leaders in leadership development and to do some organizational development and strategy work with them. Now, we are positioned as a plain glass consultancy. So when people hire us, they've got problems and we've got solutions. But what they don't know is that all of our consultants, trainers, and coaches are Christians. And we've designed this as what we call a businessry, business blended with ministry, so that we can create employment for Christians, we can seed the gospel and our faith in the places where we get these engagements, but with a plain glass strategy. Well, the client loved us. We got great results. They raved about everything. And last Christmas season, they wanted to fly us in person to meet with the 40 leaders. See, we'd been doing all of the work virtually up till then. So we flew out to California where the university is located, and it's the holiday season, it's December, and we come in and they're checking us in, and they said, hey, they're giving us name badges and all that stuff, and they said, hey, while you're here, there's some ground rules on campus. One of them is that there's some terms that are hate speech. We consider these terms hate speech. And one of them was Merry Christmas. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. So we have just brought a dozen Christian consultants that they love and are raving about. They kept saying, there's just something about you guys. We just love you. And then as we're checking in, they're saying, you can't say Merry Christmas. That's hate speech. I mean, God literally deployed us into the enemy lines, so to speak. And I turned to my business partner, who's Chinese, Steve Chua is his name. And I said, Steve, this is the underground church. The only difference is it's in California. It's not in China. So my point is, I think each and every one of us needs to figure out what our version of being shrewd as serpents and gentle as doves looks like. And rather than thinking that there's one cookie cutter approach, I think each of us needs to figure out what is the calibration of stained glass to plain glass that fits right for us. Yes, sir.
Ask a different question. The denominations coming together as one somehow, or I'm just curious how you define that.
Wow, these are great questions. How does Chuck define unity in the church?
How does Jesus define it?
Yeah, how should we think about unity in the church? A place I'll start to answer your question. When I came to Christ over the course of a decade, so I'm studying comparative world religion and philosophy, and I went back to all the original source material. So I'm reading the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, the Torah, the New Testament. I dove into philosophy like the Analects of Confucius, the Dialogues of Plato. So I'm way out here looking at all of this thought religiously and philosophically, and then kind of walking myself down through this funnel, filtering my way down to what became a conviction for Christianity. And my frame of reference for that was a Christian worldview as opposed to some of these other faith traditions. So for example, I reached the conclusion that I don't believe in reincarnation. If I were Hindu, I would. And there were many others, right? And one of the things that has so struck me about the Christian church once I became a Christian, and I started to realize inside of all of these denominations, we major on the minors, and this is my opinion. So for example, we have massive debates about baptism, when it has to happen, if it's immersion or sprinkling or this or that, and I'm not saying that baptism doesn't matter. What I am saying is that for us to throw the baby out with the bathwater because we reject other Christians as Christians because they don't quite align with us on a particular point of theology, that to me is a massive mistake. And I believe that Jesus spoke passionately to this in John 17. I mean, think about this with the disciples. If we were at work, this is like his last meeting with his team. He knows he's about to die. So what he's trying to communicate to them are the most important things that he believes that they need to remember. And what does he camp out on? Unity. That we would be one as he and the Father are one. This was such a prominent thought. The Apostle Paul echoed this so powerfully with the visual metaphor of a body, the body of Christ, with many members, but ultimately one purpose. So my point is, I think God has spoken very directly that is not just an option, it's a requirement for us as the church. And I believe that although institutionally and systematically we are broken apart in many ways, I believe that the way that we change that is relationally. This is why, like well, just for fun, I'm curious. So if you were to identify a denomination that you're affiliated with, if at all, what would it be for you?
I don't define one.
Awesome. He doesn't even define one. What about you?
Christian non-denominational.
Christian non-denominational.
I don't define it.
Wow. They're all non-denominational or interdenominational, because I would suggest to you that non-denominational has almost become a denomination. Do you see what I'm saying? Where we start to create these thoughts. Now, here's what's kind of cool. If I went around all these tables, I'm sure eventually we would have like a Baptist and a Presbyterian sitting next to each other. Just imagine that for a moment. So free will, predestination, or imagine this, a Presbyterian and a Pentecostal. So now we're going from crunchy in the word to juicy in the spirit, right? And all of that matters, but what matters more is how we show up together in the world. I believe that the workplace is one of the best places to level the playing field. So a lot of the systems and institutions, this is the last part of my answer to your question, I don't think it's going to be easy to change them. They will continue to demarcate themselves, differentiate themselves, separate themselves. But that doesn't mean that we can't choose to sit at the same table, work collectively for the common good, and be the Big C church. The workplace, I think, is one of the best places for us to accomplish that. And it starts with us, and the glue is relationships. So let me just encourage you there.